The dim lights of Murphy's bar cast long shadows across the metal tables. Smoke from various alien pipes and cigars created a thick haze that hung in the air like fog. The space station Kepler 442b was known throughout the galaxy as a neutral meeting ground where beings from different worlds could drink, trade stories, and forget their troubles for a while. Commander Crixtal sat alone at a corner table, his 4 muscular arms wrapped around a large mug of fermented grain alcohol. His compound eyes, each the size of a human fist, stared into the amber liquid as if searching for answers to questions he wished he had never asked. The veteran Zephyrian soldier had seen more battles than most beings saw in 10 lifetimes, but tonight he looked older than his 67 standard years. The cantina was filled with the usual mix of traders, smugglers, and off-duty military personnel from dozens of different species. Most gave the scarred warrior a wide berth, sensing the darkness that surrounded him like an invisible cloud. But a group of young alien soldiers, fresh from their first deployment, had been watching him for over an hour. "That's Commander Crixtal," whispered Jorik, a young Mantarian with green scales and bright yellow eyes. "He fought in the Great Galactic War. They say he has more combat medals than any living soldier." His companion, a blue-skinned Altarian female named Zara, leaned closer. "My instructor at the academy said he was there when the humans first joined the war. He commanded the 47th Zephyrian Strike Battalion." The third member of their group, a stocky Corellian named Vex, snorted through his trunk-like nose. "Humans? Those primitive apes from the third planet in the Sol system. What could they possibly teach warriors like us? They barely had spaceflight when the war started." Jorik looked around nervously. "Keep your voice down." "I heard that human. Forces turned the tide of several major battles. There are stories about what they did to enemy troops." "Stories," Vex said with a dismissive wave of his thick arm. "Propaganda to make the humans seem more important than they really are. They have no natural weapons, no armor plating, no enhanced strength. Just soft pink skin and simple metal tools." Zara studied the old commander's scarred form. Deep gouges ran along his arms and chest, souvenirs from plasma rifle burns and energy blade cuts. One of his compound eyes was clouded white, blind from some long-ago injury. "Look at him. Something terrible happened to create wounds like those. Maybe the stories are true." The young soldiers had been drinking for several hours, building up their courage with each round of drinks. Finally, Jorik stood up and walked over to the commander's table. His steps were slightly unsteady, but his voice was respectful when he spoke. "Commander Crixtal, sir. We're sorry to bother you, but we wondered if you might share some stories from the war. We're all new to military service, and we would be honored to learn from your experience." The old warrior looked up slowly, his good eye focusing on the young Mantarian. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he gestured to the empty chairs around his table with one of his lower arms. "Sit down, younglings. But understand that war stories are not entertainment. They are lessons written in blood and pain." "Ah, you sure you want to hear them?" The 3 young aliens exchanged glances and nodded eagerly. They pulled their chairs closer to the table as Crixtal took another long drink from his mug. "Very well, but first, you buy the next round. And you, listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you might save your lives someday." Vex signaled the bartender for another round of drinks. When the fresh mugs arrived, Crixtal stared into his drink again, gathering his thoughts. The cantina's noise seemed to fade away as he began to speak in a low, gravelly voice. 15. Cycles ago, when I was still young and foolish enough to believe in easy victories, my battalion received orders to secure the jungle world of Verdania 7. Intelligence reports said the planet had strategic value because of its location near the shipping lanes to the core worlds. He paused to take another drink, and the young soldiers waited patiently for him to continue. The mission seemed simple enough. A small human garrison had established a military outpost in the planet's northern continent. 300 soldiers. According to our scouts, my battalion numbered 800 of the finest Zephyrian warriors in the fleet. We had the latest plasma rifles, personal energy shields, and advanced tactical equipment. The humans had projectile weapons that fired metal bullets like something from a museum. Zara leaned forward. 300 against 800? That doesn't seem like a fair fight. Kriksdal's mandibles clicked together in what might have been laughter, but there was no humor in the sound. That's exactly what I thought, young. 1. We had overwhelming numbers, superior technology, and decades of military experience. The humans were new to galactic warfare. They had been fighting wars on their own planet for thousands of years, but those were primitive conflicts with simple weapons. So what happened? Jorik asked. We landed our assault ships 2 kilometers from their compound and began our approach using standard galactic military doctrine. Perfect formation, coordinated advance, overwhelming firepower. Everything by the book. Kriksdal's voice grew quieter. Their commander was a man named Colonel Jake Morrison. A career soldier from Earth's former Marine Corps, whatever that means. Our intelligence file said he had fought in several conflicts on his home world, but nothing that should have prepared him for modern warfare. Lex nodded confidently. Exactly what I said. Primitive experience against advanced tactics. The outcome was obvious. The old commander's good eye fixed on the young Corellian with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. The outcome was obvious, yes, but not in the way any of us expected. Kriksdal drained his mug and set it down with a heavy thud. The human compound looked like nothing special from our aerial reconnaissance. Basic defensive positions built from local materials. Trenches and barriers that seemed almost crude compared to our standard fortifications. Their weapons were simple ballistic rifles that fired chunks of metal using chemical explosives. No energy weapons, no plasma cannons, no particle beams. Sounds like target practice, Bex muttered. That's what I thought too. Kriksdal's voice took on a darker tone. We began our assault at dawn, just as the twin suns of Verdania 7 rose. Over the jungle canopy. 800 Zephyrian warriors advancing in perfect formation. Energy shields shimmering in the morning light, plasma rifles fully charged and ready to fire. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them as other patrons unconsciously leaned in to listen to the veteran's words. The first indication that something was wrong came when my point squad reported movement in the trees ahead. Not the random motion of native wildlife, but coordinated movement that suggested organized resistance. But our sensors showed nothing. No energy signatures, no metal contacts, no heat sources that indicated enemy positions. Jorik frowned. How is that possible? All military equipment generates some kind of detectable signature. That's what we thought too. But humans, it turns out, have a talent for working with materials that don't show up on standard sensors. They use organic compounds, natural fibers, and primitive techniques that our advanced equipment was never designed to detect. Kriksdal gestured for another drink, and the young soldiers waited impatiently for him to continue. The old warriors. Hands shook slightly as he lifted the fresh mug to his lips. We were 50 meters from their outer perimeter when the jungle exploded around us. Commander Kriksdal stared at his drink for a long moment before continuing his story. The 3 young aliens waited in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by growing unease at the darkness in the old warrior's voice. The explosions came from everywhere at once, Kriksdal said slowly. Not energy weapons or plasma charges, but crude chemical explosives buried in the ground. Devices so simple that our sensors had dismissed them as natural mineral deposits. The humans had spent weeks preparing the battlefield, turning every tree, every rock, every patch of ground into a potential weapon. He took another drink and continued. My lead squad simply vanished in the first blast. 8 veteran soldiers, gone in an instant. Not killed by superior technology or advanced tactics, but by containers of chemical explosive buried in the dirt like some ancient booby trap. Zara shifted uncomfortably in her chair. But surely your energy shields protected most of your forces? That's what we thought. Our personal shields could deflect plasma bolts and energy beams without any trouble. But the humans weren't using energy weapons. They were throwing pieces of metal at us using controlled explosions. Simple chunks of iron and steel that passed right through our shields like they weren't even there. Vex frowned. That doesn't make sense. Energy shields are designed to stop all forms of projectile weapons. No, Crystal corrected him. Energy. Shields are designed to stop high-velocity energy projectiles and charged particles. They work by creating an electromagnetic field that disrupts the molecular structure of incoming energy attacks. But a simple piece of metal moving at sublight speed, the shield doesn't even recognize it as a threat. The old commander's compound eyes focused on something far beyond the cantina walls, seeing events that had happened 15 cycles ago as clearly as if they were happening again. After the initial explosions, my remaining forces regrouped and continued the advance. We had lost perhaps 50 soldiers, but we still outnumbered the humans by more than 2 to 1. I ordered my troops to spread out and approach from multiple angles to avoid further trap zones. A smart tactical decision, Jorik said, so I thought. But the humans had planned for that too. As my forces spread out across the jungle, they became vulnerable to a different kind of attack. Individual soldiers started disappearing, picked off one by snipers hidden in the tree canopy. Crystal paused to order another round of drinks. His hands were steadier now, but his voice remained heavy with old pain. The sniper fire came from distances that should have been impossible with their primitive weapons. Our intelligence reports said human ballistic rifles were accurate to maybe 500 meters at best. But they were hitting my soldiers from over 1,000 meters away, placing shots with surgical precision. How is that possible? Zara asked. Their lead sniper was a human named Sergeant Lisa Torres, a female soldier who had spent years hunting animals on her home world before joining their military. She understood wind patterns, gravity effects, and trajectory calculations in ways that our computer-assisted targeting systems couldn't match. But more than that, she understood patience. The young aliens exchanged confused glances. Patience didn't seem like a military advantage. You have to understand how galactic warfare normally works, Crystal explained. Most species fight using overwhelming firepower and direct assault. We identify targets, we concentrate our forces, and we attack with maximum intensity until the enemy is destroyed. Quick, clean, efficient. That's how we were trained at the academy, Vex agreed. Humans fight differently. They study their enemies for weaknesses, they learn individual habits and patterns, and then they wait for the perfect moment to strike. Sergeant Torres spent the first hour of the battle doing nothing but watching my officers through her weapon scope, learning how they moved, how they gave orders, how they positioned themselves relative to their troops. Crystal's voice grew quieter. Then she began eliminating them one by one. Not random shots at easy targets, but carefully chosen kills designed to cause maximum confusion and panic. First my communications officer, then my senior sergeants, then my vehicle commanders. Each shot came from a different position, and by the time my soldiers could return fire, she had already moved to her next hiding spot. The cantina around them seemed to fade away as the old warrior continued his tale. Other patrons had stopped, their own conversations to listen, drawn in by the haunting quality of his words. But the sniper attacks were just the beginning. As my forces tried to adapt to the long-range threat, they encountered something even worse. Human soldiers who seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts, striking without warning and vanishing before we could react. Invisibility technology? Jorik suggested. Nothing so advanced. Just primitive camouflage techniques that worked better than any cloaking device. The human squad leader was a man called Lieutenant Commander Ben Hayes. He and his team had spent days studying the local jungle, learning every tree, every shadow, every sound. They covered themselves with mud and plant material until they looked like part of the forest itself. Crichton drained his mug and continued. Hayes' squad would wait motionless for hours, letting my patrols pass within arm's reach without being detected. Then they would strike at the rear guard, eliminating soldiers with knives and clubs, taking their weapons and equipment, and disappearing back into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. Vex looked skeptical. Knives and clubs against plasma rifles? That seems impossible. You're thinking like a civilized being who fights honorable battles, Crichton said with bitter laughter. Humans don't fight honorably. They fight to win, using whatever methods work best. Hayes' team understood that in jungle terrain, a silent blade is often more effective than a plasma rifle that announces your position to every enemy within kilometers. The old commander's voice took on a haunted quality. They moved through the forest like predators, hunting my soldiers for sport. Sometimes we would find bodies arranged in patterns designed to frighten and demoralize the remaining troops. Other times, soldiers would simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind only their weapons and equipment. What about your superior numbers? Zara asked. Surely 800 trained soldiers could overwhelm a few dozen humans using primitive tactics. Numbers mean nothing when you can't find your enemy to fight them. Every time we tried to concentrate our forces for a coordinated attack, the humans would fade away like smoke. When we spread out to search for them, they would pick us off individually. And all the while, they were learning our patterns, studying our weaknesses, and preparing new surprises. Crichton gestured toward his scarred arms. These wounds didn't come from energy weapons or plasma burns. They came from human-made explosive devices called grenades. Simple metal containers filled with chemical explosives and metal fragments. The humans would throw them into groups of my soldiers, causing terrible injuries without ever exposing themselves to return fire. The young alien stared at the old warrior's scars with new understanding. What they had assumed were battle honors from glorious combat were actually reminders of a desperate struggle against an enemy who refused to fight by accepted rules. The psychological effects were almost worse than the physical casualties, Crichton continued. Humans use sound as a weapon. Not sonic disruptors or acoustic cannons, but simple recordings played through speakers hidden throughout the jungle. The screams of wounded Zephyrian soldiers mixed with human war cries and primitive music that seemed designed to trigger fear responses in our nervous systems. That's barbaric, Jorik whispered. Barbaric, yes, but also effective. My soldiers began jumping at shadows, firing at imaginary targets, and questioning every order. The humans had turned our own advanced nervous systems against us, using our enhanced hearing and threat detection abilities to keep us in a constant state of alert exhaustion. The cantina had grown completely quiet now, with beings from dozens of different species listening to the veterans' account of human warfare tactics that defied all conventional military wisdom. After 6 hours of fighting, my battalion had been reduced by nearly half. We had killed perhaps 20 humans, but they continued to fight with the same intensity as if they had suffered no losses at all. That's when I realized we weren't fighting soldiers, we were fighting something much more dangerous. Commander Crichton's good eyes stared into the distance as he continued his story. The 3 young aliens leaned closer, no longer excited about hearing war tales, but unable to look away from the veteran's haunting account. After losing half my battalion in 6 hours, I made the decision to pull back and establish a siege around the human compound. Standard military doctrine says that when direct assault fails, you surround the enemy and wait for their supplies to run out. Most species surrender within 3 to 5 days once their food and water are gone. He took a long drink before continuing. I had 400 soldiers left, more than enough to maintain a complete blockade around 300 humans. We had advanced replicators that could produce food, water, and ammunition indefinitely. Our equipment was designed for extended campaigns. The humans had only what they had brought with them to the planet. Vex nodded approvingly. A siege is the logical choice when facing an entrenched enemy. Cut off their supplies and wait for them to weaken. That's what I thought too, Crixtel said with a bitter laugh. But humans don't follow logical patterns. They adapt to impossible situations and find ways to survive that defy all military planning. The old commander gestured to the bartender for another round of drinks. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the fresh mug. The human compound's logistics officer was a woman named Captain Amy Rodriguez. According to our intelligence files, she had managed supply chains for human military units on several different worlds. But nothing in her record suggested she could work miracles. What kind of miracles? Zara asked. The kind that turn a 3-day siege into a 3-week nightmare. Rodriguez had organized a supply network that used every possible resource on the planet. While my forces were setting up the blockade, her teams were already foraging for edible plants, setting up water collection systems, and establishing what they called gardens in hidden locations throughout the jungle. Crixtel paused to organize his thoughts. The memories were still painful even after 15 cycles, but that was just the beginning. The humans had brought something called seeds with them. Tiny plant embryos that could grow into food-producing organisms. Rodriguez had her teams planting these seeds in concealed locations miles from the compound, creating a network of hidden food sources that our patrols never found. How could they maintain these remote gardens while under siege? Jorik asked. That's where their tactics became truly disturbing. Every night, small teams of humans would slip through our patrol lines like they were made of shadow and mist. Not to attack our positions, but to tend their hidden crops and gather supplies. They moved through terrain that should have been impossible to cross without detection. The veteran warrior's voice grew quieter. Major Pete Collins was the human officer in charge of these nighttime operations. A man who had spent years hunting dangerous animals in Earth's wilderness before joining their military. He understood stealth and patience in ways that our advanced sensors couldn't track. But surely your detection equipment could locate humans moving through the jungle, Vex protested. Our sensors were designed to detect military equipment, energy signatures, and standard life forms. But Collins and his teams had learned to mask their heat signatures using mud and vegetation. They moved in patterns that mimicked local wildlife. They even controlled their breathing and heart rates to avoid triggering our motion detectors. Crixtel drained half his mug in one long swallow. Collins' teams would infiltrate our positions not to inflict casualties, but to steal supplies and gather intelligence. They would take food, ammunition, and equipment, leaving behind items designed to disturb and confuse my soldiers. What kind of items? Zara asked nervously. Pictures of my soldiers' families, obtained by hacking our communication systems. Personal messages that showed they knew details about our home worlds, our military units, and our individual backgrounds. Recordings of alien languages that contained threats and psychological warfare, designed to create fear and doubt. The cantina around them had grown completely silent. Beings from dozens of different species listened with growing horror to the account of human tactics that violated every accepted rule of civilized warfare. But the worst part was the laughter, Crixtel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Human laughter, recorded and played from hidden speakers throughout the jungle. Not angry or threatening sounds, but genuine amusement. As if the entire siege was some kind of entertainment for them. That's impossible, Vex said, but his voice lacked conviction. No military force could maintain morale under those conditions. Human morale actually improved as the siege continued. Our intercepted communications showed their soldiers telling jokes, sharing stories, and maintaining discipline that would have been impressive in a luxury barracks, let alone a besieged compound under constant threat. Crixtal's compound eyes focused on each of the young aliens in turn. You have to understand that most species fight wars to achieve specific goals. Territory, resources, political advantage. When the cost becomes too high, rational beings negotiate or surrender. But humans seem to view the siege as a test of their abilities rather than a military conflict. What do you mean? Jorik asked. They turned survival into a competition. Different human units would compete to see who could capture the most. Alien equipment, who could infiltrate the deepest into our positions, who could create the most effective psychological warfare. They kept score like it was some kind of game. The old commander's voice took on a haunted quality. Captain Rodriguez organized contests to see which teams could stretch their supplies the longest. She had soldiers competing to create the most nutritious meals from foraged materials, the most efficient water purification systems, and the most creative ways to recycle waste into useful resources. They were starving, and they made it into entertainment. Zara whispered, "Not starving, that was the problem. Our intelligence estimates said they should have exhausted their food supplies within a week. But Rodriguez had created a system that turned organic waste, including human waste, into fertilizer for their hidden gardens. They used primitive techniques to preserve and process local vegetation into nutritious meals." Crixtal paused to gather his strength for the next part of his story. 3 weeks into the siege, my soldiers were showing serious signs of stress and fatigue. Constant night raids, psychological warfare, and the knowledge that the humans seemed to be thriving under impossible conditions had broken down military discipline. "But you still had them surrounded," Vex pointed out. "Eventually they would have to surrender or attempt a breakout." That's what I kept telling myself. But Colonel Morrison, their commanding officer, had other plans. He began sending individual challenges to my officers, daring them to single combat. Not mass battles or tactical engagements, but personal duels using primitive weapons. The veteran warrior's scarred hands clenched into fists around his mug. Morrison himself challenged me to hand-to-hand combat using only knives and physical strength. No energy weapons, no advanced equipment, just 2 soldiers testing their skills against each other. "Did you accept?" Jorik asked. I wanted to. Every warrior instinct the first possessed demanded that I face him in honorable combat. But my military training told me it was a trap, a psychological manipulation designed to break down the command structure of my forces. So what happened? Morrison continued issuing challenges every day, accompanied by detailed intelligence about my officers' personal backgrounds, their families, their military records, and their individual strengths and weaknesses. Information that should have been impossible for humans to obtain. Crixtal's voice grew darker. The challenges became more specific and personal. Morrison would dare individual soldiers by name, referencing their combat records and questioning their courage in terms that were perfectly calculated to trigger responses from different alien species. He was trying to divide your command structure. Zara observed. Exactly, and it was working. Some of my officers wanted to accept the challenges to prove their honor. Others wanted to end the siege with overwhelming force. The psychological pressure was destroying unit cohesion more effectively than any direct attack. The old commander finished his drink and set the empty mug down with deliberate precision. That's when I realized we weren't fighting a conventional military force. We were facing something that understood warfare at a level that went beyond weapons and tactics. They were fighting a war inside our minds. Commander Crixtal ordered another round of drinks for the table, his movements slower and more deliberate than before. The 3 young aliens waited in tense silence, their earlier excitement completely gone. The cantina around them had grown quiet, with other patrons leaning in to hear the continuation of the veteran's dark tale. 3 weeks into the siege, I received an urgent communication from Fleet Command. Crixtal began, his voice heavy with old pain. My superiors were not pleased with the situation. The entire Zephyrian military was being embarrassed by a small group of humans using primitive weapons and crude tactics. He took a long drink before continuing. Admiral Zorix himself contacted me directly. He said that the prolonged siege was making our forces look weak and incompetent. Other species in the galaxy were starting to question Zephyrian military superiority. The situation had to end immediately. Vex shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What did the Admiral order you to do? He authorized the use of orbital bombardment. The battlecruiser Storm of Victory was positioned in high orbit with enough firepower to turn the entire human compound into melted glass. No more siege, no more psychological games, no more embarrassment. Just complete destruction from space. Zara's eyes widened. That seems like excessive force against 300 soldiers. That's what I thought at first. But Admiral Zorix made it clear that this was no longer about military objectives. It was about maintaining the reputation of Zephyrian forces throughout the galaxy. We could not allow primitive humans to continue resisting our superior technology and training. The old commander's compound eyes focused on something beyond the cantina walls, seeing events that still haunted his dreams after 15 cycles. I prepared my forces for immediate withdrawal once the bombardment began. Standard procedure is to pull back to a safe distance before orbital weapons are fired. But as we were preparing to move, we received an unexpected transmission from the human compound. From Colonel Morrison? Jorik asked. Yes, but this was not another challenge to single combat or psychological warfare. This was something much more disturbing. Morrison's voice was calm and professional, like he was discussing routine military business instead of facing complete annihilation from space. Crixtal paused to gather his thoughts, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his mug. Morrison said that human intelligence had been tracking all alien ship movements in the system for the past several weeks. Not using advanced sensors or military equipment, but with simple radio telescopes and observation posts hidden throughout the outer planets. Radio telescopes? Vex asked with confusion. Those are primitive scientific instruments. They can't track military vessels. That's what we thought too. But humans had been using these crude devices to monitor our communications, track our supply ships, and map the positions of our entire fleet. Information that should have been impossible to obtain without advanced military intelligence systems. The veteran warrior's voice grew quieter and more disturbing. But that was not the worst part of Morrison's message. He calmly informed me that human infiltration teams had identified the location of our colony ship Glorious Dawn. Zara gasped. The civilian transport? But that was parked in the outer system, completely separate from military operations. Exactly. 20,000 Zephyrian civilians, including families, children, and elderly individuals who had nothing to do with the war. They were supposed to be safe, protected by distance and secrecy. Crixtal drained his mug completely before continuing. Morrison explained that human teams had somehow managed to board the colony ship weeks earlier. They had planted what he called nuclear devices in critical areas throughout the vessel. Nuclear devices? Jorik whispered. Those are primitive fission weapons, crude but devastating. Morrison said that if the orbital bombardment proceeded as planned, the nuclear devices would detonate automatically. The colony ship's hull would be breached, its life support systems would fail, and every civilian aboard would die within minutes. The cantina had become completely silent now. Beings from dozens of different species stared at the old warrior with expressions of horror and disbelief. But that would be mass murder, Vex said, his voice barely audible. The deliberate killing of innocent civilians violates every rule of civilized warfare. That's exactly what I told Morrison during Our communication. His response was something I will never forget as long as I live. Krickstall's good eye focused on each of the young aliens with an intensity that made them lean back in their chairs. Morrison said, and I quote his exact words, "Commander Krickstall, war is not a game played by civilized rules. War is about survival. And humans will do whatever is necessary to ensure that survival. Your people chose to bring war to our door. Now you will live with the consequences of that choice." The old commander's voice took on a haunted quality. What terrified me most was not the threat itself, but the way Morrison delivered it. No anger, no emotion, no regret. He spoke like he was reading a technical manual or discussing weather patterns. This was not the desperate bluff of cornered animals. This was the calculated strategy of apex predators. But surely it was a bluff, Zara said hopefully. Humans couldn't have actually infiltrated a military vessel and planted explosives without being detected. That's what I wanted to believe. But Morrison provided detailed information about the colony ship's layout, crew assignments, and security procedures. Information that could only have been obtained by someone who had actually been aboard the vessel. Krickstall ordered another drink, his hands now shaking visibly. Morrison also transmitted video recordings of human soldiers moving through the colony ship's corridors, planting devices and gathering intelligence. The recordings were date-stamped from 2 weeks earlier, proving that the infiltration had happened while we were focused on the siege. How is that possible? Vex asked. Military vessels have advanced security systems and trained guards. Human infiltration specialists had studied our security procedures for months before the war began. They understood our patrol schedules, our sensor limitations, and our psychological blind spots. They had learned to move and act like Zephyrian crew members, using stolen uniforms and forged identification. The veteran warrior's voice grew darker. But the most disturbing part was how they had accomplished the infiltration. Morrison explained that human teams had approached the colony ship using small civilian vessels, disguised as traders and refugees seeking passage to neutral systems. Disguised as refugees? Jorek whispered. They had studied our language, our customs, and our social behaviors until they could pass as Zephyrian civilians. Some of the infiltrators were actually Zephyrian collaborators who had been recruited or coerced into helping human intelligence operations. Krickstall paused to let this information sink in. The young aliens stared at him with growing horror as they realized the implications. Morrison's message included recordings of conversations between human agents and Zephyrian civilians who had provided information about military operations, family members serving in the fleet, and security procedures for various installations. That's impossible, Vex protested. No Zephyrian would betray their own species to primitive aliens. You're still thinking like someone who has never faced real warfare, Krickstall said with bitter laughter. Humans understand that every intelligent species has individuals who can be influenced through fear, greed, ideology, or personal grievances. They had spent months identifying and recruiting assets throughout our civilian population. The old commander finished his drink and stared at the empty mug. Admiral Zorix faced an impossible choice. He could proceed with the orbital bombardment and accept responsibility for the deaths of 20,000 civilians. Or he could cancel the attack and allow the humans to continue their psychological warfare against our forces. What did he decide? Zara asked. The bombardment was canceled. The Storm of Victory powered down its weapons and withdrew to a safe distance. For the first time in Zephyrian military history, we had been forced to back down from a direct confrontation because of threats against our own civilians. Krickstall's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That's when I realized the true horror of human warfare. They don't just fight to win battles or capture territory. They fight to break the will of their enemies at the deepest possible level. They understand that the greatest victory is not killing your opponent, but forcing them to surrender their principles and abandon their values. The cantina remained silent for long moments as the implications of the veteran's words sank in. Finally, Jorok found his voice. But surely the threat was just psychological warfare. Humans wouldn't actually murder innocent civilians. Crixtal looked at the young Mantarian with an expression that held decades of hard-won wisdom and bitter experience. That, youngling, is exactly what makes them so terrifying. You never know for certain what they will or will not do. And that uncertainty becomes a weapon more powerful than any plasma rifle or energy cannon. Commander Crixtal sat in silence for several minutes, staring at his empty mug while the weight of his memories pressed down on him like a physical force. The three young aliens waited patiently, understanding that the veteran was gathering himself for the final part of his story. Around them, the cantina remained eerily quiet, with dozens of beings from different worlds hanging on every word. The siege continued for 2 more days after the orbital bombardment was cancelled. Crixtal finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, but everything had changed. My soldiers knew that we had been outmaneuvered by primitive humans using nothing but intelligence and psychological warfare. Morale collapsed completely. He gestured for another drink, though his movements were now slow and unsteady. Admiral Zorix contacted me again on the 2nd day. The Galactic Council had intervened in the conflict, demanding immediate negotiations to end what they called an embarrassing standoff that was making all military forces look incompetent. Vex leaned forward. The Galactic Council? But they never interfere in military operations. They do when those operations become a symbol of resistance that threatens the established order throughout the galaxy. Word of the human siege had spread to every inhabited system. Other species were starting to question why their own military forces couldn't achieve what 300 humans had accomplished with primitive weapons. Crixtal took a long drink before continuing. The council arranged for a prisoner exchange that would allow both sides to withdraw with their honor intact. No admission of defeat, no reparations, just a mutual agreement to end hostilities and negotiate a peaceful settlement. That seems reasonable, Zara said hopefully. It was the best outcome we could have hoped for under the circumstances. But as my forces prepared to leave Verdania 7, Colonel Morrison requested a final meeting under a flag of truce. Professional courtesy between military commanders, he called it. The old warrior's compound eyes focused on something far beyond the cantina walls. I agreed to the meeting, thinking it would be a standard debriefing between opposing officers. Exchange of information about casualties, discussion of prisoner treatment, formal acknowledgement of the end of hostilities. But it wasn't that simple, Jorok asked. Nothing involving humans is ever that simple. Morrison approached our landing zone alone, carrying only a white flag and a small recording device. He looked exactly like what you would expect from a human military officer. Medium height, simple uniform, no visible weapons or advanced equipment. Crixtal paused to organize his thoughts. But when he spoke, I realized I was facing something much more dangerous than any weapon. Morrison had the calm confidence of someone who had planned for every possible outcome and was completely prepared for whatever might happen next. What did he say to you? He thanked me for conducting an honorable campaign according to the rules of civilized warfare. He complimented my tactical decisions and acknowledged the skill and bravery of my soldiers. Everything you would expect from a professional military officer. The veteran warrior's voice took on a haunted quality. Then he told me something that changed my understanding of human warfare forever. He said that the nuclear threat against our colony ship had been complete bluff, Zara gasped. A bluff? But the video recordings, the detailed intelligence about the ship's layout, all real. Human infiltration teams had indeed boarded the colony ship and gathered extensive intelligence about its operations. But they had never planted any explosive devices. The entire threat was psychological warfare based on information gathering and our own assumptions about human ruthlessness. Crichton drained his mug and continued. Morrison explained that human military doctrine includes something called strategic deception. The art of making your enemies believe you are capable of actions that you would never actually take. But that's dishonest, Dex protested. Dishonest, yes, but also effective. Morrison said that humans understood the psychological profiles of most galactic species well enough to predict how we would react to specific types of threats. He knew that Zephyrians would never risk civilian casualties, even to achieve military objectives. The old commander's voice grew darker. He also explained why humans had chosen Verdania 7 for their stand. It wasn't a strategically important world or a vital resource center. It was selected specifically because its jungle terrain would favor human tactics over advanced alien technology. They planned the entire conflict from the beginning. Jorik asked with growing horror. Morrison said that human intelligence had been studying galactic military doctrine for years before they joined the war. They understood our strengths, our weaknesses, and our psychological blind spots better than we understood them ourselves. Crichton ordered another drink, though his hands were now shaking badly. He told me that the 300 soldiers in the compound were not desperate defenders fighting for survival. They were volunteers who had specifically requested assignment to what they knew would be an impossible mission. Volunteers? Zara whispered. Morrison explained that humans view impossible odds not as a reason to surrender, but as an opportunity to test their abilities against the ultimate challenge. The soldiers in the compound had competed for the chance to face overwhelming enemy forces using only primitive weapons and tactics. The cantina around them remained completely silent as beings from dozens of different species contemplated the implications of the veteran's words. But the most disturbing revelation came when Morrison showed me the recording device he had brought to our meeting. He said it contained documentation of every tactical decision, every psychological operation, and every strategic innovation that humans had used during the siege. Why would he share that information with you? Dex asked. Because he wanted me to understand that the siege of Verdania 7 was not just a military operation. It was a training exercise and intelligence-gathering mission designed to teach humans how to fight against technologically superior alien forces. Crichton's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Morrison said that copies of the recording would be distributed to every human military unit throughout the galaxy. The tactics that had defeated my battalion would become standard training material for future conflicts. That means every human soldier would know how to replicate what happened at Verdania 7, Jorik said with growing dread. Worse than that. Morrison explained that humans learn from every conflict and constantly improve their methods. The next time galactic forces encountered human resistance, the tactics would be even more sophisticated and effective. The old warrior finished his drink and set the empty mug down with deliberate precision. As Morrison prepared to leave our meeting, he offered me his hand in what humans call a handshake, a gesture of respect between professional soldiers. Did you accept? Zara asked. I did. And in that moment, I understood the true horror of human warfare. Morrison's grip was firm, but not aggressive, his expression respectful, but not submissive. He showed no hatred, no anger, no desire for revenge. Just the calm professionalism of someone who had completed a difficult job successfully. Crichton. Compound eyes focused on each of the young aliens in turn. That handshake was more terrifying than any weapon or threat, because it showed me that humans don't fight wars out of emotion or desperation. They fight wars because they view conflict as a natural part of existence that must be mastered like any other skill. What happened after the meeting? Dex asked quietly. My forces withdrew from Verdania 7 and I filed my official report with Fleet Command. The siege was classified as a tactical withdrawal in the face of changing strategic priorities. No mention of defeat, no acknowledgement of human superiority, just bureaucratic language that hid the truth. The veteran warrior stood up slowly, his scarred body moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to live with old injuries. But I knew the truth. We had encountered something that challenged every assumption about warfare, technology, and civilization. Humans don't just wage war, younglings. They become war itself. They adapt, they endure, and they never surrender, no matter how impossible the odds. Crystal placed some credits on the table to pay for the drinks and looked at the three young aliens one final time. Remember this story when you face your first real battle. Remember that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the best weapons or the largest army. The most dangerous enemy is the one who refuses to accept defeat and finds ways to turn every disadvantage into a weapon. He walked toward the cantina's exit, pausing at the doorway to deliver his final warning. The galaxy learned something important. At Verdania 7, we learned why predators from high-gravity death worlds should never be underestimated. We learned that humans don't fight to win battles. They fight to survive, and survival is non-negotiable. Commander Crystal disappeared into the station's corridors, leaving the young aliens to contemplate the true meaning of human warfare. Around them, the cantina slowly returned to its normal noise level, but the veteran's words continued to echo in the minds of everyone who had heard his tale. The three recruits sat in stunned silence, their earlier excitement about military service replaced by a deep understanding of what real warfare meant.